I'd like to welcome Dan Balin to the stage from Joe White. Dan is the key account manager for craft beer in Asia Pacific. Welcome, Dan.
Great to be here today. Look, I thought coming into the cooler months of the year, good chance to talk about the spice of your beer, which is specialty malt production and applications. Chance to sort of showcase some of the locally produced malts we have. Obviously, many of you probably grew up as brewers looking at specialty malts from Europe and other places like that, but obviously we have some beautiful malt that's produced up the road here in Ballarat. So, firstly I'll introduce the team I've got with me today. I'm actually missing one person on this slide, which I'll talk to in a second. But myself, Daniel Bayon, as I said before, key account manager for industrial and the craft business as well in Asia Pacific. Evelyn Matisse, who's joined us all the way from Belgium on a temporary assignment for 12 months. So good to have Evelyn here. She actually previously worked at Stella Artois as a brand manager. And Chris Booth, who's recently joined our team as a craft and specialty planning and execution manager. Previously was actually with our business, but more looking at our larger customers for bulk export. So it's really good to have him as part of the craft and specialty team working closely with the Ballarat guys. And also joined us here is our managing director, Pierre-Eric, who's, there he is at the front, very, very, very thankful to have him here as well. Has been with our business for about 9 months here in Australia and 10 years prior to that, looking at barley procurement. So a little bit about Bort Malt to start off with. For those of you who aren't aware of who we are and where we come from, so Joe White is part of Bort Malt. There's 1,200 masters of malt, 27 malting plants across 5 continents. We have around 3 million tonnes of total malting capacity. We used to be the number 1 in terms of production. We're now number 2 in terms of production, but we are number 1 for passion, we like to say. And Joe White is also part of a bigger craft family. So we also have craft malting brands in other countries, so obviously UK, Europe, South America and North America. So a little bit focused on the Australian business. We have 7 malting plants across all the major malting barley growing regions in Australia, which you can see on that map of Australia. And more importantly for this presentation, we actually have the largest dedicated specialty malt production facility in the Southern Hemisphere at Ballarat. So we can produce around 10,000 tonnes of roast and crystal malt per year. We'll go into a little bit more detail about what we produce and how we produce it as well. So a good place to start with this presentation in terms of specialty malts is actually sort of going through the different types of malts. So broadly speaking, common malt types, obviously you can get a lot more. Common malt types we do around pale malts, roast malts and crystal malts. Now, pale malts we know, Pilsner malts, Trad Ale, Munichs. Roasted malts can be anywhere from a 30-40 EBC up to a 1600 EBC for a very dark beer. And crystal malts are lighter, actually a lot lighter than a 25, but in our range we do a 25 EBC all the way up to a 300 EBC in our standard range. But you can go even darker, a 400 EBC, which are commonly used for non-alc beers and low-carb beers as well. Something I'll touch on a little bit further, which I've included as the pale malt in this because of how we produce it, but dextrin malt. So dextrin malt, which we produce, is part of our pale malt range, but it's actually a common substitute for a Cara Pils, which you're all very aware of. So the malting process. Some of you may have heard this a number of times. Some of you may not be up to speed with the malting process, but I think it's a good area to delve into when we're looking at specialty malt production. So firstly, steeping. So steeping is around basically recreating spring. That's what we're doing. We're telling the grain to wake up, to actually start to modify. We're increasing moisture from around 10% to 45%, and it's a process that takes around 1 day. That's mainly a physical process, as was said here. Germination is a biochemical process. So once we've got that moisture up to 45%, that's where the magic starts to happen. What we're doing is the enzymes that we're creating are turning the starch into fermentable sugars, which you're using for your brewing to make alcohol. The last stage of the process is kilning, which takes around 1 day and has there's two key goals for us to hit. One is we're removing the moisture down to sub 5%. The second is we're creating colour, as colour is obviously important for taste and flavour and the look of your beer. And we know the value on beer, so fermentable sugars create alcohol. Protein will add to body to the beer and foam, and obviously the Maillard components will add colour. The last stage of the process, which we'll talk about, is roasting. So we can bring grain into a roaster 3 different ways. One, where it's just roast barley and roast wheat. So we're bringing raw barley and raw wheat straight to the roaster. So obviously for a stout, for example, we can bring green malt into a roaster and create crystal malt. So that's actually bringing malt that's 45% moisture into a roaster and creating that gelatinization effect. Or we can bring kiln malt in to just create a simple black malt. And here's some examples of roasters. So basically it's a giant coffee roaster. The 2 pictures on the left, I think it's on the left of your screen, are actually from our Ballarat plant. So there are 2 Bath roasters. They're around 2.5 tonnes of production capacity per batch. And the third photo is not from our plant. It's actually a ProBat roaster, but you can see the blades inside the roasting. The roaster will actually help turn the grain around and make the uniform colour. So roasted malts, we know, is really that sort of toasty, coffee type flavour. And typically how we're getting that is really time and temperature, and it's very high temperatures, which I'll show you on the next slide. And that's how we create those sort of dark and those intense flavours. Important to know when you're using roasted malts is there's very, very limited fermentable sugars. So really the only use for it is colour and flavour. And typically we see it obviously black IPAs, stouts, porters, ambers and brown ales. And yeah, as you can see, time and temperature. So it's quite a linear relationship in terms of colour and creation of colour. So it's all around how much temperature you apply and how long you do it for. And you can see we go all the way up to a really, quite a dark, actually we can do a black malt up to 1600 EBC. As you can imagine, you're getting over very high temperatures, and it's quite a process that requires a lot of care from the guys that do it at Ballarat. And just lastly on roasted malts, you can see this is a Congress mash, so a lab scale mash, and the difference between a 200 EBC and a 1200 EBC. So crystal malts. Crystal malts ideally adding that sort of sweetness, colour and body to beer. And you get that real sort of caramel flavour is the most common, typically for a lighter crystal malt. And what we see is that, again, similar to the roast malt, pretty limited enzymatic activity. It's not really there to sort of add anything other than colour and taste. But what we also add is, because of the limited fermentability, we actually add a little bit of body to the beer as well. So we see it again in most beer styles, most ales, but where we also see a strong presence is in lagers. So particularly in Japan and Korea, we'll see around 2%, an addition of 2%, and it really creates that malt-forward lager. It's a little bit sweeter and that sort of malt presence. So we say with crystal malts, though, the production process is far more complicated. It starts during germination. So it's both the biochemical and a physical process. So in that instance, basically during the germination process, this starch is actually saccharified through the strong alpha and beta amylase action. And once we roast that over 80 degrees, the sugars that we've created actually start to crystallise. So what we'll see if you come over to our booth later, we've got a farinator there where we can show the inside of the grain, and you can see that real sort of crystal look, and that's when you know you're going to get a crystal that will provide that sort of sweet taste to your beer. And again, as I said before, most ales, but again, it's really, we're seeing a very common in lagers as well. So the time and temperature for crystal malts, again, very different to roast. So we had the roast chart. It was basically a linear relationship. With crystal malts, there's actually a component where you actually have to dry the malt down from 45% to under 5%. Then you get gelatinisation at around 80 degrees and half an hour into the process. Beyond that, that's when we start adding colour. And again, Conquest mash, so 120 EBC versus a 200 EBC. So light crystal and a dark crystal malt. Just fun fact, light crystal malt is probably our biggest selling and most commonly used in lagers. So what I mentioned before is just touching on dextrin malt. So we do have a dextrin malt in the market, which is a direct substitute for carapils, and there's also another locally produced one called, I think, Dexter or something like that. So I wanted to talk about the differences in the product. So when we set about creating the dextrin malt for Joe White, what we did is we wanted to focus on the application, what you guys are actually using the product for, not the production process. So a lot of people will focus on, with carapils, how it's produced, not actually what it's there to do. And we know that you guys are using it because you want to add body, foam retention, and how we do that is really two ways. So we need to keep the colour low. So we need to back off the modification as much as possible. We need the protein to be high. And when we do both of those things, we actually maximise the long-chain dextrins, which is how you get that foam retention and body in your beer. So if I compare that, a Joe White dextrin to a carapils, the main difference for us is that we use a drum kiln, not a roaster. And why that's important, for two reasons. One, control. We have much more control in a kiln than a roaster. Second is we actually keep the moisture a lot lower. So you can see with the carapils, the maximum moisture they allow is around an 8%, whereas we confidently say is under 6%. Now, when you buy moisture, you buy water, not grain. So obviously there's a cost impact to that. The other benefit to buying Joe White dextrin is it's produced locally, so typically more cost effective. Now, pointing to the colour chart down the bottom, just going back to that crystal piece. So you can see that a lot of the energy and time initially is actually pre-drying and gelatinisation, and colour is difficult to control. That's the challenge you have when you produce a carapils and a roaster. With a dextrin, you don't have that challenge. Happy to have more discussions or take questions on that later. But yeah, certainly an exciting product that's available through Joe White, through Bintani now as well. And I think this is the last slide. I think it's important to recognise the Bintani team on a wonderful 30 years. Phil, Dale and Peter obviously beforehand, but also the greater Bintani team. Joe White have had a long association with Bintani. It's something we're really, really proud of. So I just want to congratulate, and I think we should put our hands together for the Meddings boys and the other Bintani guys as well.